So get ready, because today we're going to dive deep into how to speak like a pro in English. I mean, imagine being able to give a big presentation, or nail that job interview, or even just feeling confident in everyday conversations. That's what we're talking about today. So you
Yeah.
shared a podcast episode about improving English speaking skills. And let me tell you, it is jam-packed with insights. We're going to break down exactly what it means to speak like a pro, and we'll give you some tips to help get you there. Ready to level up your communication game?
I am so ready.
All right, let's go. Okay, first things first. What does speaking like a pro even mean? It can't just be about fancy vocabulary or a perfect accent, right?
You're right. It's not about that. The podcast episode we're looking at breaks it down into four main elements: clarity, confidence, connection, and purposefulness. And what I found really interesting was that idea of purposefulness. It's not just about saying words, it's about actually having an impact with what you're saying.
Yeah, that's so true. Think about a speaker that you really admire. What is it about them that makes their words resonate with you?
Well, I think it's because they have a clear message and they deliver it in a way that connects with their audience. They're not just talking, they're communicating with a purpose. And the best part is, the podcast really emphasizes that anyone can achieve this. It doesn't matter what your current English level is. It's all about mastering these key elements and putting in the work.
Okay, that's when I start to get a little nervous, though.
Mm.
Because, there are so many challenges that can come up when you're trying to speak. I mean, who hasn't felt that fear of making mistakes or struggled with limited vocabulary? And don't even get me started on those pesky filler words like and I feel like I'm constantly battling with those.
Oh, I totally get it. It's totally normal to feel that way. And the podcast episode even acknowledges those challenges. But here's the thing. They are not insurmountable. The podcast is actually full of tips to help you overcome these common challenges and improve your speaking skills.
Okay, now that is reassuring. I'm definitely ready for some practical advice. So where do we even begin?
Well, one of the most powerful tips that really stood out to me from the episode was the importance of active listening.
I've heard that before, like listen more than you speak. But what does that actually mean in practice?
It means paying close attention to how skilled speakers talk. It's not just about what they say. We can learn so much by observing their tone, their word choices, their pauses, even their body language.
Okay, I like that. So it's like studying a master communicator in action. But let's be real, sometimes the biggest hurdle for me is vocabulary. It can be so hard to express myself clearly and confidently when I feel like I'm lacking the right words.
Absolutely. And the podcast offers some really great advice on that front. It's not about memorizing those endless lists of random words. It's about focusing on vocabulary expansion in a more targeted way.
So how do we know which words to focus on?
Think about the situations that you find yourself in most often. Are you preparing for job interviews? Do you have to give presentations? Or maybe you just want to feel more comfortable in everyday conversations. Identify the key themes and topics that are relevant to your life, and then focus on learning vocabulary specific to those areas.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about building a vocabulary that's actually useful to you, not just memorizing a bunch of fancy words you'll never actually use.
Yeah.
But how do we make sure that we really learn those new words?
Practice, practice, practice. And the podcast has some creative ways to do that. Speaking out loud is key, whether that's talking to yourself, recording your voice, or finding a language partner to practice with. That repetition will help build that muscle memory.
Okay, I get it. It's like training your mouth and your mind to work together. And the more you practice, the more natural and then effortless it will become.
Exactly. It's all about repetition and consistency. Now, here's a tip that might seem a little counterintuitive, but it's actually incredibly powerful. Slow down.
Wait, really? I always thought speaking quickly was a sign of fluency.
It's a common misconception, but speaking clearly is so much more important than speaking quickly. When you slow down, you actually give yourself time to think. You can choose your words more carefully, and you can pronounce them correctly. It's all about prioritizing clarity and making sure your message is understood.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about quality over quantity, right? I can definitely see how rushing can lead to mistakes and misunderstandings.
Exactly. And even though we're focusing on speaking, the podcast also emphasizes the importance of body language. Even in virtual settings like video calls, your posture can project confidence and make a big difference in how you're perceived.
Wow, I never really thought about that before. I guess communication really is a whole body experience. It's not just about the words you say.
Absolutely. It's about sending a consistent message through your verbal and nonverbal cues. Your body language can either reinforce or totally undermine your words. So it's important to be mindful of how you're presenting yourself.
So how do we make sure that our body language is actually working for us and not against us?
Well, the podcast actually includes some helpful tips on posture and presence. For example, they suggest sitting up straight, making eye contact, and using hand gestures to emphasize key points. Even when you're not physically in the same room with someone, you can still project confidence and engage your audience through video calls.
I love how they actually give those practical tips to make all of this actionable. But I have to admit, sometimes it's hard to visualize how all these tips would come together in real-life situations.
Well, that's where those role play scenarios come in. One of the coolest things about this podcast is that they actually demonstrate those tips in action. You get to hear how people apply these strategies in different situations. It makes it a lot easier to see how it all actually works.
Oh, that's a great idea. So it's like you're right there in the situation, learning by example. I'm actually really curious to hear about these role-play scenarios. What kind of situations do they cover?
They have three main scenarios: introducing yourself in a formal setting, handling a challenging question, and making small talk. And what's interesting is that they don't just go through the motions, they really break down each scenario and highlight specific techniques and phrases that illustrate all the tips we've been talking about.
Okay, so let's hear about these role-play scenarios. I'm really curious to hear how they handle that first one. Introducing yourself in a formal setting. That's always a little nerve-wracking for me.
Oh yeah, I get that. But they break it down in a way that makes it feel a lot more manageable. They really emphasize the importance of clarity, confidence, and purposefulness. It's all about delivering that concise and impactful message, one that highlights your key strengths and really leaves a positive impression.
I am all about making a good first impression, so I'm definitely taking notes here. Can you give me an example of how they actually do this in the role play?
Yeah, sure. So they show how you can start with just a simple, friendly greeting, like, "Good morning, everyone." And then they go on to outline their experience and skills. But they do it in a way that's both informative and engaging. So instead of just listing off accomplishments, they really frame them in a way that shows how those experiences can add value to whatever situation they're in.
So it's not just about what you've done. It's about how your experience is relevant to the people you're talking to. That's a good point.
Exactly. And then they end on a positive note, something that expresses their enthusiasm and willingness to contribute. It's subtle, but it's a powerful way to leave a lasting impression.
I love that. It's like a blueprint for a perfect self-introduction. All right, what about the second scenario? Handling a challenging question. That one always makes me sweat a little bit.
Oh, I can relate to that one for sure. But the podcast does a great job of showing you how to stay calm and collected, even under pressure. They emphasize acknowledging the issue, focusing on solutions, and maintaining a positive attitude.
So it's not about avoiding tough questions. It's about facing them head on in a professional and constructive way.
Right. So they actually demonstrate how you can start by thanking the person for raising the question, which honestly immediately diffuses some of that tension. And then they give a really clear and concise explanation of the situation. But they do it without getting defensive or making excuses.
That's so important, taking ownership of the situation without letting it completely derail the conversation.
Exactly. And then they wrap it up by outlining the steps they're taking to address the issue and to prevent it from happening again. It shows that they're proactive and solution-oriented, even when faced with a challenge.
That is such an impressive way to handle a tough question. I mean, they basically turned a potentially negative situation into an opportunity to demonstrate their problem-solving skills.
Exactly. And then that last scenario, making small talk, it might seem a little less intimidating, but it can actually be tricky to navigate. The podcast really highlights how important it is to be friendly, curious, and engaged. It's about finding that common ground, showing genuine interest in the other person, and just keeping the conversation flowing naturally.
So it's not just about making idle chit-chat. It's about actually connecting with the other person and building that rapport.
Right. And they demonstrate this beautifully in the role play. They start with a simple introduction and then ask open-ended questions to learn more about the other person. Instead of just talking about themselves, they actually focus on actively listening and showing that they're genuinely interested.
That is such a good reminder. Sometimes I get so caught up in my own nerves that I forget to actually listen to what the other person is saying.
Yeah, I think we all do that sometimes. But this podcast really emphasizes the importance of being present and engaged in the conversation. And then, to wrap it up, they share a little bit about themselves to keep that conversation balanced.
So it's about finding that sweet spot. Being a good listener, but also contributing to the conversation.
Exactly. And they do it all in a way that feels very natural and authentic. It doesn't sound forced or rehearsed at all.
These role-play scenarios are seriously insightful. I feel like I'm already learning so much just by hearing you describe them. But what about those of us who are still struggling with confidence? How do we get over that fear of speaking up and making mistakes?
That is a great question. And the podcast actually addresses this head on. They emphasize that progress really comes from consistent effort and taking small steps. It's about setting realistic goals, focusing on one thing at a time, and celebrating your wins along the way.
So it's not about becoming some perfect speaker overnight. It's about embracing that journey and focusing on continuous improvement.
You got it. And one of the most powerful tips they give is to simply practice speaking as much as possible. The more you do it, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
All right, that makes sense. It's like anything else. The more you practice, the better you get. But what if you don't have anyone to practice with?
Well, the podcast suggests some great solo practice techniques. You can talk to yourself, you can even record your voice and listen back to it, or even practice in front of a mirror.
I like that. It's all about creating those opportunities to practice,
Yeah.
even if you're by yourself.
Right. And as you start to see those little wins, your confidence is naturally going to grow. It's like a positive feedback loop.
That's encouraging. It's a good reminder that we're all capable of improving our speaking skills.
Mm.
It just takes effort and the willingness to step outside of our comfort zone a little bit.
Absolutely. And this podcast doesn't just focus on the technical aspects of speaking, they actually delve into the importance of authenticity, too.
Oh, I love that part. It's not just about sounding professional. It's about bringing your own personality and perspective to the table.
Yeah, exactly. The podcast wants us to find our unique voice and use it to really connect with others in a meaningful way. It's about recognizing that our individuality is an asset, not a liability.
I think that is so important. It's about being true to ourselves,
Yeah.
even when we're trying to speak like a pro.
Right. It's about finding that balance between professionalism and authenticity. And they actually have some insightful tips on how to do that. Like, they suggest using humor, or sharing personal anecdotes, or even letting your passion for your topic shine through.
That makes so much sense. It's about injecting your personality into your communication style
Yeah.
and making it more engaging and relatable.
Exactly. And it's not just about being entertaining, it's also about building trust and credibility. When you're authentic, people are more likely to connect with you and to believe what you're saying.
That's a great point. Authenticity breeds trust. I'm really starting to see how all these elements work together to create a truly powerful communication style. But I have to admit, I do sometimes worry about sounding unprofessional. If I let my personality show too much,
I think that's a valid concern. And the podcast acknowledges that finding that right balance can be tricky. It's about being mindful of the context and the audience. There's a time and a place for humor and personal anecdotes. And it's important to use your judgment.
so it's about being adaptable and kind of adjusting your communication style to suit the situation.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling a lot more confident and inspired now.
That's great to hear. And as you continue to develop your speaking skills, just remember it's an ongoing journey, not a destination. There's always room for improvement. And even the most experienced speakers are constantly learning and refining their craft.
That's a good reminder. It's about embracing that process and being open to growth.
Exactly. And the podcast leaves us with a final, thought-provoking question to consider. So the podcast emphasizes finding your own unique voice. But what does that really mean? Especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with all these different communication styles and expectations. Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, how do we balance being true to ourselves while also navigating all those, complexities of professional communication?
It's something I'm still figuring out myself, but I do think it's a question worth exploring.
Absolutely. What if the answer isn't about finding that one perfect voice? Maybe it's about embracing all the different voices that we each have within us.
I love that idea. It's like recognizing that our voices are constantly evolving and adapting to different situations, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's about being flexible and authentic
Yeah.
and always open to growth. It's not about trying to fit into some predefined mold. It's about bringing our whole selves to the table.
And that's what makes communication so fascinating, right? It's this dynamic and ever-evolving process. And the more we embrace that, the more effective and fulfilling our communication will become.
Oh, this has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new toolbox of strategies now.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely feeling a renewed sense of confidence.
That's awesome to hear. And remember, the best way to really solidify these skills is to put them into practice.
You're so right. I'm ready to start experimenting with some of these tips and see what kind of impact I can make.
I think that's a great idea. Start small. Maybe pick 1 or 2 tips that really resonate with you. And just focus on incorporating those into your everyday interactions.
Yeah, that sounds manageable.
Yeah.
It's about building those positive habits one at a time
Yeah,
and gradually expanding my comfort zone.
exactly. And as you start seeing those wins, your confidence is going to soar. You'll be amazed at how much progress you can make.
I'm excited to see what I can do. It's like a whole new world of communication possibilities has opened up.
And remember, we're always here to support you, so don't hesitate to reach out and share your progress, or your challenges, or even just your triumphs.
Well, thank you so much. You've been such a fantastic guide through this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure learning from you.
The pleasure was all mine. I always enjoy exploring these topics with you and our listeners.
All right, listeners, that's a wrap for this deep dive. But remember, the learning doesn't stop here. We encourage you to keep exploring this amazing world of communication and to keep pushing yourselves to new heights.
Yeah, your voice matters, and the world needs to hear what you have to say. So go out there and speak with confidence, speak with clarity, and speak with authenticity.
And most importantly, have fun with it. Communication is such a gift. So embrace it. Use it to connect with others, inspire change, and make your mark on the world.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep speaking your truth.
We'll catch you on our next deep dive adventure.